The residents of Krakow lived in fear during the 1960s of a vampire that stalked the ancient polished city in search of victims to satiate his bloodlust. But Karol Kot was not the same type of creature of the night often associated with the vampiric tales from folklore or the haunting figure from F.W. Murnau's silent movie Nosferatu. This Vampire of Krakow was a knife-wielding maniac who preyed on the elderly and young alike. So fearful were citizens that they dared not whisper the nickname given to the killer by the press, who became known as the Vampire of Krakow, a name that struck terror into people of all ages. After leaving 2 women wounded and a 3rd dead, the vampire vanished for a 17-month period before resurfacing to hunt younger victims. Arrested in June 1966, Kot was charged with 2 murders and executed for his crimes. The story of Karol Kot is not simply one of an impressionable and awkward teenager, confused at an ever-changing point in a young man's life, but that of an aberrant psychopath acting out his twisted fantasies of violence and murder. It is possible that Kot went on to become the inspiration for the serial killer Lucian Staniak, known as the Red Spider, who was most likely the literary creation of an overzealous crime writer.
The nightmare began on September 21, 1964, when on that day, a fledgling killer attempted to claim his first victim, albeit unsuccessfully. The target of his rage was attending church that day, and as he would later describe himself in court, he planned to wait in the house of God for an elderly parishioner, a knife concealed in his coat. "How annoying," he later exclaimed. No one showed up. It was only as he was leaving, frustrated at his missed opportunity, that he chanced upon an ideal victim. As 48-year-old Helene Velgen entered the church, she noticed a young man deep in prayer. When she knelt to pray, the young man pulled out a bayonet concealed in his jacket and drove a knife deep into her back. By aiming for her heart, he intending for the attack to be fatal. The maniac had stabbed the woman several times in the back and seriously injured. She slumped to the floor in severe shock. Her attacker hurried out of the church, under the belief that the woman was dead, but as luck would have it, she survived. When he was a safe distance away, and by his own admission, he licked the blade clean of blood. Despite her injuries, the victim was able to recall that her attacker had a red shield stitched onto his jacket, indicating to the police that he was a high school student. Detectives were perplexed by the incident, wondering who would want to harm a church-going member of the community. The second attempt happened shortly afterwards, just 2 days later on September 23rd. This potential victim, 78-year-old Franziska Lewandowska, was spotted leaving a tram, then followed and stabbed in the back on the stairs leading up to the front door of her apartment. This caused her to stumble and fall down the stairs. The attacker thought his victim was dead as he quickly fled the scene. However, this attack also proved unsuccessful. The elderly woman survived, but never regained her full health, having broke her spine and her legs were left paralyzed. As with the previous incident, the victim reported to police that it was a young man who had attacked her. Both victims gave similar descriptions of the man, and police knew they were looking for a cowardly suspect who approached his victims from behind, catching them off guard. 6 days later, on September 29th, the same young man struck again, only this time he would experience his first kill. 86-year-old Maria Aplichta was at her local church when she was approached from behind as she walked to Jana Street and stabbed. This time, the killer caused significant wounds, and before she lost consciousness, the victim managed to whisper to Noon that her attacker was a young man. Out of sight, the attacker licked the blood from the blade of his knife. Maria Aplichta died the next day. While the doctors were trying to save her life, a young man visited the hospital to inquire about the victim. This curious visitor was 17-year-old Karol Kot, who would earn the nickname the Vampire of Krakow. Kot was born in Krakow on December 18, 1946, and would spend all his life in the city. Krakow had suffered greatly under the Nazi occupation of Poland and served as a significant location for the establishment of Jewish ghettos. from where Jews of all ages were deported to the gas chambers of the death camps. Unlike many other Polish cities, Krakow remained relatively undamaged during the war and was spared the destruction of the city's historical and architectural legacy. Kot was only 17 when he decided to turn his attention to humans. His first victim, 48-year-old Helen Velgen, was stabbed several times from behind while she knelt in church to pray. Once Kot had plunged his knife into Velgen, he fled the scene. Vampire Kot recounted later that he relished licking every drop of blood from the knife after stabbing Helen Velgen. Velgen survived, as did his second victim Franciszka Lewandowska, who was knifed in the back on the stairs, leading to her apartment 2 days later. But his next victim was not so lucky. Vulnerable pensioner Maria Plichta, 86, was Kot's next target. Kot stabbed her brutally from behind following her from church, and she was rushed to hospital where she later died. Even more disturbingly, the twisted killer visited the hospital to ask how she was doing because he wanted to revel in the pain and suffering he had caused. Kot described a friend, Danuta, as his girlfriend. Although it's unclear whether she reciprocated his feelings, he would confide in her, telling her of his bloodlust, but she didn't take him seriously. He even held a knife to her throat. To, in his words, see the insane fear in her eyes. But she thought he was messing about. It was only when Kot showed Danuta a pocket full of glass shards that he was planning to slice her up with that she convinced him to see a doctor. The medical professional sent Kot away with vitamins. With his bloodlust not yet satisfied, Kot experimented with poison, leaving drinks laced with deadly arsenic in popular pubs, hoping that someone would get unlucky. He even left a poisoned bottle of beer outside the door of a girl he found attractive, but no one succumbed to his poisoning attempts. Frustrated, Kot returned to his true love, blood and knives. Watching a group of children running up and down a hill as they competed in a sledding contest, Kot felt bored with targeting old ladies and decided to try his hand at children. He selected an 11-year-old boy and murdered him in the snow, filling the small body with brutal knife wounds, far more than were necessary to kill the child. His badly mutilated body was found at the bottom of the sledding hill, the snow around it soaked red with blood. Little Leszek Kolek had been stabbed 16 times. A horrifying attack on an 8-year-old girl was what finally prompted Danuta to contact the police. Kot had bragged about his latest victim to Danuta, but she didn't believe him until she read a news article about the stabbing of a young girl. Danuta contacted the authorities and Kot was arrested shortly afterwards. Kot's final victim, an innocent little girl, was on her way to check the family's mailbox when Kot stabbed her 8 times in the back and stomach. Miraculously, she survived. Kot was arrested in June 1966 and hung in March 1968 after being found guilty of 2 murders, 10 attempted murders, and for arson attacks. While waiting to receive his sentence, Kot was remorseless. He said, "The pleasure I felt when the knife was cleaving the meat. It's impossible to describe the feeling. The experience is worth the gallows." Kot underwent many psychological tests, with experts amassing more than 8,000 pages of evidence. He was, however, found of sound mind to face the full consequences of his murderous actions. Arraigned before the court on May 3, 1967, Kot gave a very detailed testimony of his crimes before the court, along with his plans that he had not yet managed to carry out. These plans that he revealed were so extreme that the court had them withheld. Throughout the proceedings, Kot did not display any sign of contrition or remorse. On the contrary, he was relaxed and seemed unaware of the possible sentence he could receive. The trial aroused great interest amongst the public, who demanded he receive the death penalty. The most contentious issue presented at the trial was the assessment of his mental state at the time of the murders. 2 teams of experts were consulted on the matter, whose opinions of Kot's sanity differed. Forensic experts from Krakow found Kot to be the classic example of a psychopath with a deviation from the norms of temperament, drive, and character, coupled with a lack of higher emotionality. They presented to the court that Cott was a limited sanity murderer who could not adapt to social norms. Meanwhile, psychiatrists believed that Cott was aware of the harmful effects of his actions and was, to some degree, even able to control them. The fact he was able to refrain from attacking under certain circumstances further supported their theory of Cott's overall sanity. During visits to the crime scenes and during the court hearings, Cott smiled and looked like a good-natured boy. When weapons or detailed descriptions of his crimes were presented to the court, he visibly smiled and appeared happy. Consequently, the court upheld the opinion of the psychiatric experts, and on July 14, 1967, they found Cott guilty of murder, condemning him to death. Because of this verdict, he lost his citizen rights. As Cott was only sentenced for the murder of 11-year-old Leszek Kolek, his lawyers filed an appeal to the Supreme Court on November 22, 1967. Based on diminished responsibility, the court took into consideration the testimony of the forensic experts along with Cott's young age and overturned the death penalty ruling and instead sentenced Cott to life imprisonment. The general prosecutor of the Polish People's Republic, however, had the right to revise the sentence and on March 11, 1968, reconvened the Supreme Court. Once again, Cott was sentenced to death by hanging. The judgment of the Supreme Court was based on the callous murder of the 11-year-old boy and Cott's attempt to kill the 7-year-old girl, stating, taking into account the defenseless beings, his cynicism, and lack of remorse, the only right punishment is the death penalty. The sentence was carried out on May 16, 1968, and Karol Cott, the Vampire of Krakow, was executed by hanging. Some sources describe how after the execution, an autopsy of Karol Cott showed that he had been suffering from a previously undiagnosed large brain tumor. However, author Przemysław Semczuk disputes this fact in his book. According to the author, autopsies were not carried out on convicts sentenced to death. Moreover, no official documents are known to exist that confirm an autopsy was carried out on Karol Cott. The legend of the Vampire of Krakow endures, and today he exists as a minor celebrity in Poland. And although the elder residents once lived in fear of a vampiric creature of the night, it is the younger generation who have become enthralled with fascination by his misdeeds. For customers over the age of 18, one can enjoy the macabre Krakow, a free walking tour of the crime scenes associated with Cott. Those with a thirst for more than just true crime can enjoy an arsenic-free beer for Fivesel on the Rheineck at the Cott Corolla pub, where the mascot is a grinning cat perched next to an effigy of Edgar Allan Poe. Despite this renewed interest in Cott, the pain and suffering he caused can never be forgotten, and much like the Nazis he so admired, Karol Cott should be remembered as a warning from history.
Violence begets violence. Hate begets hate. Let us break this cycle and choose the path of peace and understanding.